everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started just because we want to get to the meat of the matter and why you all are spending your Thursday morning or afternoon on Zoom for this important topic. So whether you are a CRT aficionado, an expert, or just trying to learn what is CRT, you don't know, you heard about it somewhere, this is the place for you for the next 90 minutes or so, 80 minutes, right? And so we want to first just welcome you. We're so excited that you're here with us. We want to thank the Pullias Center of Higher Education at the University of Southern California for awarding Dr. Tichavakunda and myself this alumni award. And we thought it was a great idea to just get the people together, right? And get the experts in the room, folks who love to talk about critical race theory. And we know that this is such a pressing topic, not only just in research, but in practice, right? And so we wanted to make sure that we were able to join in dialogue. I'm just going to do a little housekeeping for us. And I'm not able to see your slides, Diane, but I'm guessing you'll go through in that order that we talked about before. And so wanted to let you know, so we have a few sort of warm-up questions that we'll ask our panelists, and then we're going to get into some rapid fire where we just want them to give some quick answers. So it's a little bit different than maybe your typical webinar. And then we'll have some targeted questions that we'll ask to each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up for you all to use the Q&A feature. The chat is going to be disabled. Those of you who know the work of CRT and what it is, you know, sometimes we get the haters and that sort of thing. So we want to make sure that we're not giving them a voice and a place here. This is our story. This is a story that we want to tell. So we will control that narrative today. But you all, if you are a hater, feel free to put it in the Q&A. And if we opt to answer that question, we will do so. And I will be facilitating those questions. Dr. Tichavakunda will be moderating our panel with our illustrious panelists here. We are, for the sake of time, not going to go over their bios are extensive. The work they are doing is extensive and important, and it matters. So we want y'all to know that, but we are not going to go over those bios today. So we will make sure that you all get those sent out. You know, we'll make sure that you all see that QR code where you can go and run that. The other reminder we wanted to remind you is that 5 lucky panelists will get a signed copy of these books. So we are going to purchase books and get them to the authors and sign. So you'll get a signed copy of everyone on the panel who has a book. So there's a total of 4 books that you'll get a nice care package from the Pullias Center with those books. So that's going to be great knowledge, right? You have Black Campus Life by Dr. Tichavakunda, Counter Story by Dr. Martinez, On Critical Race Theory by Dr. Ray, and then Studying Latinx, Latino Students in Higher Education, right? Like these are going to be really great pieces and add to your libraries. And we just want to also support our scholars who are here and giving of their time. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic, the proverbial mic, to Dr. Tichavakunda to say a few words and then get us into this panel. And again, I will be on the back end answering questions. And I didn't even introduce myself. Professor Raquel Rall, Associate Professor at the University of California, Riverside in the School of Education, where I also am the faculty chair there. And my work sits at the intersection of really race, equity, and governance in higher education. And so with that, I'll be quiet. And I will let Dr. Tichavakunda take the lead.
Awesome. I'm following you, Dr. Rall. So thank you. Thank you to the Pullias Center. My name is Antar Tichavakunda. My pronouns are he, him. I'm an assistant professor of race and higher education at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we are so excited to have everyone here. I won't get too deep into who I am, but I do want to share a couple words, right? I know the panelists are like, you ain't say you're going to share some words, but this is what I'm going to do, right? So this is by Charles Lawrence III, one of the foundational critical race theorists. And I think it'll be helpful in grounding us before we get into introductions. How do we do critical race theory in these perilous times? How do we define ourselves when there is no ideologically grounded mass movement to define us? How do we resist an organized and well-funded ideological assault from the right that has been vicious and successful beyond anything we anticipated? Charles Lawrence said that in 1997. I think that's super relevant right now as we think about this conversation we're about to have. So without further ado, I want to hear from our panelists. We're going to be brief, and so we can get to the meat of the questions. And like Dr. Rall said, I encourage you to look at their body of work, their scope of work. So I'm going to ask you all 2 questions. 1, what led you to critical race theory? And 2, what critical race theory related work are you doing right now? And to kick us off, Dr. Briscoe, could you start with that? Can you start?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Caleb Briscoe. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an assistant professor at Mississippi State University. Happy to be in community with you all. So what led to me using CRT? So I am a racism, and racial climate scholar. And so at the time, I was interrogating racialized incidents that were taking place at predominantly white institutions, particularly incidents around Blackface, hate crimes, ongoing murdering of Black and Brown people on campuses. And I was really trying to understand both why are these things happening, and not from a personal stance who may have some identities and connections to these communities, but from a theoretical and methodological stance. And so as I was in my doc program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, I took a class on CRT, and I really just started to really ground myself in both the critical legal studies aspects of it, so some of the seminal foundational texts, but also looking at CRT from the lens of higher education scholars. So trying to make sense of why are these things happening? How is the permanence of racism just ever present in these incidents? How does white supremacy harm minoritized populations and ultimately often, physically and mentally kill them? And so I think the second question is, what are we working on now? So quick overview. Myself and my good colleague and friend, Dr. Veronica Jones-Baldwin at the University of North Texas, we're doing a national study right now, which was funded by the Spencer Foundation, looking at two particular aspects. One, we are interrogating the actual rhetoric and discourse that is being used right now within the CRT legislation bills across the 42 states that they have been proposed and enacted. And then the second part is we're doing national conversations with faculty across different ranks and institutional types to really unpack how are these CRT bans affecting them and or the resistance that they're experiencing on different levels in relation to these CRT bills. And so I'll mention this a little bit more throughout our time here today, but I just want to kick things off. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Briscoe. Such important work. Next, can we hear from Dr. Garcia? Would you tell us what led you to CRT and what CRT related work are you kind of working on right now?
Yes, thank you. Please cut me off because I can talk. So I'm Dr. Garcia Nicole, assistant professor at Rutgers in College Student Affairs and Higher Ed. I think that what led me to CRT was that I was actually birthed into the movement. And what I mean by that is I grapple a lot in my work of what it means to come from successive generations of communities of color that are college educated and why we don't share that legacy of knowledge. And so in my community, it wasn't really talked about, but my dad, at the time I was in high school, was a doctoral student at the University of Utah. And during that time period, he was working with William Smith. So really grappling with microaggressions and racial battle fatigue. The first conference on critical race studies and education happened at the University of Utah, where my alma mater is. And I was there in attendance as an undergrad. But really in high school, I was grappling with a very racial violent high school where I'd walk down the hallway and I'd get called a spick. And I was assumed that my parents were the help, janitors and maids. And from there, I knew that I had to activate my knowledge and know that this isn't normal and how can I push against this? And so it was my dream always to think and be and put theory into the flesh, right? And really think through what can my praxis look like? How can I back it with research so that these violent spaces don't exist for a future of our youth? And if they do exist, how do we lessen this trauma? But more importantly, how do we heal from it? And so my second line of inquiry that I'm looking at right now is really thinking about what methodologies are we limited in critical race theory and how can we grow, right? And so quantitatively, we need more work and we've been wanting more work. And it's a juxtaposition around how do we grapple with these tools that were not made for us and have been historically violent towards us. And where do we go back to, right? And so some of my colleagues and I have been grappling with that question for a long time, but more recently, Beto Velez at Eastern Washington University, who's a cartographer, bomb, shout out to her, and another colleague, Lindsay Perez-Huber at Cal State Long Beach. We are working through How do we recover our mathematical wisdom within our communities and our genius? And what does that look like? How do we think through it within our homes, right? Within where we first started to be told that we did not do well in math and science and so forth. So I'll talk more about that later, but this is what led me to CRT and where I'm going.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia. But really looking forward to hearing more about the work and how you're expanding it. Dr. Martinez, would you go next? Tell us what brought you to CRT and what type of CRT related work are you doing right now?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Asia Martinez, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm an associate professor of English at the University of North Texas. And I'm a voice from the humanities on this panel, specifically from the field of rhetoric and writing studies. In graduate school, my program had all white faculty. The materials were also dominated by white voices and white perspectives. And I wasn't represented in terms of who was teaching me and what was being taught. And I was struggling. And I didn't know what I was going to do, what my project was going to be. And I was being actively discriminated against within this program through lack of mentorship and general push-out culture. So I was really reaching, just grasping, trying to make sense of it all. And at one point during coursework, by chance, I was assigned an anthology where there was one singular reference to critical race theory. And interestingly enough, something about that term was inviting to me. And the more I followed the bibliographic rabbit hole of references, I realized this work began to give me the tools to make sense of and better articulate what was happening to me in this grad program. And so because up to this point, I hadn't had the mentorship, the teachers, the theories, the pedagogy, and the methods to guide me in the ways that my CRT teachers were now providing, I felt like I had a path now. And people like Mari Matsuda and Paul Butler have said that although they didn't study with Derek Bell, they felt they were students of Derek Bell. And I feel like I'm sitting here in a similar capacity because although I wasn't a student of any one CRT scholar in particular, I've just learned so much from them in these pursuits that I've taken. And so in terms of what I'm doing right now, my work has always focused on the CRT methodology of legal storytelling, which is also known as counterstory. And as of now, this interest in counterstory has led me to Derek Bell's archive at New York University to explore his own counterstory writing process. And I've found fascinating things. I've been primarily looking at his manuscripts of And We Are Not Saved and Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And I've found fiction manuscripts of his that far predate these writings. And I've also been in conversation with Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk about the histories of legal storytelling in relation to the humanities, especially concerning legal storytelling and its centrality to CRT as an academic field and movement. So as a result, I have lots of projects that I'll talk about as this webinar progresses and the works that are springing from this data.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. I'm super excited to hear more about that and also about the fictional work that predates what we so often think of with Derek Bell. So thank you. And last, I want to hear from Dr. Ray. What brought you to CRT and what critical race inspired work are you doing right now?
All right, sure. I'm Dr. Victor Ray. I am an associate professor of sociology and African American studies at the University of Iowa. And I feel like Dr. Martinez set me up really well because I'm going to talk about a story that I open my book with about being 2 years old, and my uncle, who is a darker than me, darker skinned Black man, had me at a parade in downtown Pittsburgh, and he put me on his shoulders. And someone called the police on him, assuming that he had abducted me and that he had kidnapped me, right? And so growing up as a mixed race, light-skinned person in a Black and white family, that was not the only time that the police were called on my caretakers, my Black male caretakers. It happened again when my dad was playing with me in the yard. So I felt like my sort of like personal history and direct comparison of experiences with discrimination kind of primed me for critical race theory. And so then when I was an undergrad at Vassar College, I read two works that had just a really profound impact on me. The first was Cheryl Harris's Whiteness as Property, which uses Harris's grandmother's passing to get a job to describe the property interest in whiteness. And that resonated me, one, for sort of the just sort of theoretical power of the idea of whiteness as property, but also because of my own experience and the bitterness with which Harris's grandmother describes being in all white spaces, folks assuming that she was white and talking openly, openly racist, openly white supremacist terminology around her in the workplace. The other thing that I read at the same time in the same class actually was Charles Mills' The Racial Contract, which has impacted my work in ways that I don't even know, but just huge impact on my work. Right now, I'm working on a couple of things that are CRT related. One is I'm thinking about my work on racialized organizations in relation to work on abolition. So I think there's a tension in my work on racialized organizations between sort of reform and abolition. And so I'm trying to think through how we can, reduce harm in organizations, which organizations are amenable to reducing harms, and which ones might need to go away. The other thing that I'm doing is I'm writing a lot of public work right now, responding to this sort of increasingly authoritarian push around critical race theory. I had a piece in The Nation last week about sort of DeSantis's recent antics in Florida, and hopefully I'll have more out soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you all for sharing this. One thing that I just want to note is how life, life shapes oftentimes our interest in critical race theory. It's not necessarily something that I need a framework for this, right? But just thinking how life experiences, experiencing violence, racial violence has led us to this in different ways. So I just want to point out that that commonality that I see there. So next, we're going to do something a little bit different, and I think it's super helpful right now, given the time limits that we have. We want to do something, we're going to do kind of like a lightning round, okay? We're going to do like a lightning round. So you will not have enough time, panelists, to really answer these questions in depth. But I think that's also a good lesson, right? You as for everyone who's watching, you will not know all about critical race theory from one webinar, from one chapter, from one article, from one book. It takes deep study, right? So I encourage all of you to look up the names that people are mentioning, look up the panelists, right? Because they have incredible work. So this is just supposed to be like a teaser for you and a challenge to our panelists to answer these questions in about, 45 seconds or so. I won't be playing wrap it up music or anything, but yeah, let's see how it goes. So we're going to go in alphabetical order, the same way we started. So Dr. Briscoe, get ready. When you think of critical race theory, what's one scholar that has really influenced you and why?
Derek Bell. #period. No, I think of it. We can't address issues of race and racism without understanding the permanence of racism. We can't unpack all of the many things that are happening right now, even when we think of the current social political climate, without first recognizing that racism exists. I don't know if that's 30 to 45 seconds, but I'm stop, or I'll keep going.
Thank you, Dr. Briscoe. Dr. Garcia.
Oh, you're asking me the same question. Yes. Sorry, I got confused. So that I already used half my time. But so when I think of critical work in CRT, I think about the juxtaposition between gender and race, and we cannot forget our critical race feminists, right? And so Patricia Williams' work, which doesn't really get talked about a lot, The Alchemy of Race and Rights and the Rooster's Egg, #spirit murdering. And I think as a junior scholar, finding that work and bringing it into a place where you can generate knowledge and a special issue around how we get spirit murdered from K through 12 all the way into academia has been really critical for me at this turn. But I will say one thing before I switch it to the next person is read as much as you can and get engulfed in it. As you need to know Derek Bell, right? You need to know these foundational scholars in order to get to the next level of how we think and conceptualize and theorize and do the research itself.
Thank you. Dr. Martinez.
Okay. It's a scholar and the piece of scholarship that was part of the question. So I have to throw in Richard Delgado and his storytelling for oppositionists and others, because that essay for me lays out the theory of counterstory that I feel like we simply don't have without that essay where he theorizes it. And I just feel like that's the cornerstone piece for those of us who do that work. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Ray.
Yeah, so I already talked about Harrison Mills. So I would say I'm a sociologist, and Dr. Eduardo Bonilla Silva's work in Racism Without Racists, he was my advisor. So let me be clear. You know, I think that remains a classic. I think it shows sort of the pervasiveness of colorblind racism as an ideology. I think it shows what that has done to policy. Also, I think the writing is hilarious. And you don't see that often in social science work. It subverts the sort of disciplinary conventions. It's a very difficult thing to do. And I actually wish more folks were stylists in their writing, in their academic writing, excuse me.
And I also want to say it's very hard for me not to comment on what everyone is saying. So please applaud me for not jumping in on everything. But next question. Is there a difference between using critical race theory for a study and being a critical race scholar or theorist? Dr. Briscoe.
Absolutely. So, and not to come for anybody, right? But using CRT, right, as a theoretical lens, analytical lens, method, that just means that you're bringing that in, right? And hopefully utilizing it in every aspect through the conceptualization and aspects of the study, right? But actually, to me, being a critical race scholar, right, or that there's ownership, right? Like you are getting in community with scholars who do this work. You are fighting for this work. You are advocating for this work. And that sometimes means that you're at opposition of folks who are against this work. Right. So it's taking a risk versus just utilizing it in some capacity.
Yeah, Dr. Garcia.
Yeah, I'm going to say hell yes, and I'm going to go for those people. So I cannot say how many times I've read something and it doesn't have any citations. It just plops CRT. I think that CRT is very unique because you can grapple with it, with the tenets. But those tenets, I also would argue, are accessible as a praxis, right? Like they're written in that way so that anyone could probably grab it and really think through it, right? They're accessible. But in terms of education, the CRT and education tenets. But yeah, there is a difference between citing and doing and being, right? Because there's so many of us that are critical race theorists that can't separate our scholarship from who we are and what we live. And that's actually an asset, right? Who we bring our subjectivities into and share with in these vulnerable spaces that allows us to talk about our traumas, to look forward to healing spaces and move forward, not just the work, but our communities as we try to uplift everything that we're doing so that we can get equity and access, right? So yes, I think those are very important things to distinguish. And that's very important if you're writing about it too. Like, are you using it or are you a scholar or are you doing both?
Thank you. Dr. Martinez, your turn.
Yeah, same thing. Yes, those tenets are key. I think Gloria Ladson-Billings has said it best in her piece, CRT, what it's not, but there is the humanities example that I like to use where there are folks like Octavia Butler who wrote Kindred or Jordan Peele who produced Get Out, and you can analyze those pieces with a CRT frame or the tenets as a framework and say this is how CRT tenets maybe show up in these media sources, but I don't think that Jordan Peele or Octavia Butler ever made claims that they are CRT scholars doing CRT work, but the tenets still apply. On the flip side, there's Derek Bell, who is CRT identified and very intentionally using the tenets to build "And We Are Not Saved" and "Faces at the Bottom of the Well." And so juxtaposing those different literary pieces, I think, helps illustrate for people those differences.
Dr. Ray.
I don't have much to add to what everyone has already said. I agree with the panel that yes, I think there's a difference. And, you know, coming from sociology, there's sort of this idea that we should be like value neutral and detached and, you know, sort of objective and away from our work. And I think CRT and sort of like the larger Black radical tradition just rejects that, right? That the work is for something, it's for making people's lives better in very concrete ways. And there's a lot of folks, again, to repeat what folks have said, who use like aspects or, you know, say, I'm doing intersectionality in this paper, or I'm analyzing structural racism in this paper, but they are not committed to the sort of transformational project of critical race theory, right? That I think is central to critical race theory.
Thank you all so much. I'm ready to write right now. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm loving all this. It's a masterclass of, I don't know, critical race thought. And I just have to say this real quick. Like, I mean, even if you look back at the genealogy of critical race theory, like the reason why a lot of these the minority law scholars left critical legal studies was because there was this practitioner theory divide, right? For a lot of critical race scholars, they said you can't separate it, right? I'm gonna stop there because yeah. Next question, I'm sorry. What is one thing about critical race theory you think a lot of people misunderstand? Dr. Briscoe.
Me starting off is not a good idea. You know, okay, so I think one, people have to stop watching Fox News. I'm just gonna throw it out there, right? If you really want to understand CRT, let's pick up the CRT work. Let's read it, let's digest it, let's understand it. So a part of the misrepresentation and not being able to understand is that you're listening to other people falsely depict CRT, right? From a very intentional political manner, right? So let's move away from that and let's do some reading, some reconciling with what CRT really is.
Thank you. Dr. Garcia.
Whew, I'm going to say the opposite. Watch Fox News so you know what's coming for you. But in terms of, I say that strategically, but I do actually teach that. You know, you want to hear the spectrum of what folks are thinking and how they are breathing, what they actually may see as race, racism, or this color evasive understanding of how the world is working. And so what realities are we willing to enter? And so I think that a common misunderstanding that I hear a lot is that CRT is here to make white people feel guilty and to be blamed. And I'm here to say, this is a structural, systemic problem. Your emotions are connected to how you navigate the world, but we aren't here to get you. We're here to understand how places of privilege and power and oppression are functioning and how you might contribute to that, demystify that or challenge it, or help us leverage your resources, right? It's about resources and power. So a lot of, I mean, I listen to Fox News every morning just so I can hear what the other half is saying. And I breathe through, I do my meditations. I'm like, okay, this is what we got today. But I go in my little Harry Potter office and I start writing. I'm like, all right, how do I make magic in response to all of this? And so I'll leave it there.
How do I make magic in response to all of this? Lovely. Dr. Martinez.
I think CRT needs to be understood as more than just a brand. It's not just a brand. CRT is an idea. And as Richard Delgado said in his 2009 history of CRT, liberal McCarthyism, you can't kill an idea. And that's what CRT is. It's an idea. Christopher Rufo talked about turning the brand of CRT toxic. And that's just preposterous because CRT is and always has been more than a brand, just so much more than that. CRT is an academic field with theory, pedagogy, method, And it's a movement, and it's both of those things with very unique timelines and histories. And what are you going to do about that? You can't kill those ideas. You'd have to get rid of all of us and our stories and our histories and our timelines and our theories and our pedagogies and the movement. And so it's not a brand. This is not a market branding exercise that they can just rebrand for us. You know, they can't do that. It's an idea, and you can't kill ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. Dr. Ray.
So I actually don't know where to start with what people misunderstand about critical race theory, given the last couple of years of just like a massive, well-funded disinformation campaign directed at what they're calling critical race theory, right? So it's not even necessarily CRT. I kind of, you know, in my book, one of the things I say is like, my job is not trying to debunk people who are in bad faith. One of the things that they want to do is sort of like draw you into a pointless argument in which they continually move the goalpost by literally making up new shit. Excuse me, but like literally making up new stuff, right? As they move along. So like, I think, I mean, to sort of echo what Dr. Martinez says, in my book and like in my classes, I try to be like, look, here's what critical race theory is. And these ideas have already shown their staying power, right? They've already shown that they have like profoundly influential outcomes if people use them and put them into practice. And so that, instead of sort of like trying to correct the record, I'm like, I don't need to correct the record. If you actually do the reading, the record is already correct, right? The record is already there. You just need to do the work to go find the goods.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. And I want to, you know, we kind of talked a bit about like what CRT is not in a way, right? You know, scaffolding is important, but I do think it's important. We also say like, it's, like I said, you're running more than this webinar to really understand what CRT is, but we talked a bit about what CRT is not. And we have folks in the audience who, you know, never really heard of CRT, and, you know, there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation out there. How would you describe CRT to someone who is unfamiliar with it? Let's do reverse order. Dr. Ray, would you mind answering that? How would you describe CRT to someone who's unfamiliar with it but wants to learn in good faith?
I think it's a set of ideas describing how race, gender, and other marginalized identities, why the inequalities based on those categories are so lasting and intractable. Right. And then, I mean, I could go more, you know, it started in legal studies, and the tenets spread to other fields as folks realized that like these were a set of good ideas that helped explain things in sociology and anthropology and political science and education.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. What about you, Dr. Martinez?
I'll just go ahead and give Derek Bell's definition, because I think, like, why not, right? He gives this definition as a footnote in his book, Confronting Authority. And he says, my writing was at the forefront of a new school of legal thought, now known and mostly accepted as critical race theory. Practitioners, often through storytelling and a more subjective personal voice, examine the ways in which the law has been shaped by and shapes issues of race. Some of the most exciting and thought-provoking scholars today are part of this movement. That's from Derek Bell.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Martinez.
Wow,
Dr. Garcia.
Hard to follow up the Derek Bell. So my interpretation, I think for me, when I'm talking with an everyday individual, or when I think about my pedagogy around CRT, it's a structural analysis, right? It's around how race and racism and white supremacy are endemic to structures and the impact of the material conditions that we have. So what does that look like? Do we have examples, right? Like student debt. Who has student debt? Black and brown students, right? Especially as a higher ed scholar. Who has food insecurities? Where do geographical lines happen with racial redlining? Like everyday examples where these are happening in material conditions help me explain what critical race theory allows us to do, is to give that analysis, right? And that it can be married to other racial theories as well. and that we can't do this work without sociologists, without political scientists, without folks in the humanities. And that's the beauty of it, is the interdisciplinary ways that it works and where we can answer questions for gaps that exist, right? So that's how I think about it.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. Dr. Briscoe.
Yeah, so it's a way of understanding issues of race and racism, right? They are structural, right? And when we think about, if I'm talking to an everyday person, I might throw out an everyday example, right? So as a Black woman, noticeably brown, darker skinned Black woman, you know, I can remember this notion of people thinking that I am not intelligent, right? Or you know, thinking about this juxtaposition of race and gender, right? And assessing things like pay, right? Or things associated, I'm from Georgia, so thinking about voter suppression rights, right? So I would provide a real life example of, here are some of the ways that these issues are happening, and point to this notion of issues of race and racism, and then connect it to CRT. So I try to walk people almost backwards, right? To be able to apply it and actually like reconcile with this notion of, okay, this is how this actually works.
Thank you all so much for these answers. I'm also very glad this is being recorded, because wow, like so succinct and so powerful. And yeah, just the quotes that we're using. This is fantastic. We're going to ask one more lightning round question. Then we're going to get to more specific questions for each of you all. So if you could give guidance to like if you give guidance to a rising scholar interested in using CRT, what advice would you give them? Let's go back to you, Dr. Briscoe.
So I think I would start from a place of really sit with some of the texts on CRT, see if there are courses that you can take, and particularly courses from those who do CRT, not just, think they do CRT. That's important to name. So if your institutions have CRT courses, I would say potentially enroll. And then also reach out to the community of folks that do CRT work. You know, there's a lot of us across the nation, many who would be willing to have conversations with you to think about, like, how do you really do this work and do it in an intentional manner, right? Depending on what you're studying across disciplines.
Thank you. What about you, Dr. Garcia?
Attend the Critical Race Studies in Education conference. Every year they have it, minus COVID, we had a little hiccup, but it was virtual. And they always do a one-on-one, what is CRT, right? And when I was a grad student, I attended, and I will never forget, Dr. Theodora Berry said, if you aren't citing Derek Bell or Richard Delgado or Alan Freeman, go back and reread and know your shit. And I was like, oh. And so every time I'm reading something or reviewing something, I'm looking for that genealogy. If you're talking about CRT, I want to see that you know it's from critical race legal studies that came into education, Lanson Billings, Tate, Solorsno, and just going from there, right? Like, if I don't see that, then I'm worried about what you're reading. And I feel like so many folks just grab something and run with it and attendance, and that's it. And that limits how we think and what we know. And also we have a duty to cite these scholars that came before us. Like, that is an honor for them, right? It's not that we own all these ideas, it's that we're building and extending, and we have to cite that legacy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia. Dr. Martinez, what about you?
I mean, I co-sign everything that Dr. Briscoe and Dr. Garcia just said. I mean, all of that is 100%. So I guess the only thing that I have in addition to contribute is that you need to have a thick skin, because you're in for a rough ride with this work, especially now. When I started this in 2007, I got pushback and resistance and questions about, why are you doing this? And is this necessary? And as I read more, which again, you need to do, I found out this is not uncommon for the legal studies people, for the ed scholars, and for anyone else who has been doing this. This is the broken record track of resistance and pushback that everyone gets in the respective fields that CRT scholars have existed. You get the same it's like a broken record. It's not original, the pushback. You get the same exact thing in every field. And so you need to be ready for that. And that's just within the liberal academic institution kind of pushback. Now there's the extra stuff, right, that's happened since, 2020, 2021. So you need to have a thick skin. You need to mean it. You need to be ready for that too.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. What about you, Dr. Ray?
I'm just going to echo Dr. Martinez. So I said earlier that Dr. Bonilla Silva was my advisor in grad school. And early on, I was like, man, what's going on? Like the reaction to, my papers and, my cohort is not great to, the ideas that I'm trying to push. And he was like, look, if you adopt an oppositional stance, like the one critical race theory puts forward, you cannot expect mainstream scholars to give you the kind of recognition that you appear to be craving, Victor, right? And so if that's the case, then you need to, be realistic about what your work is doing, who you're in community with, how you network, what you publish and where you publish, and you need to figure out ways to protect your mental space, right? And that you cannot get validation all of the time from the sources that we are socialized into believing are how you're validated in the field.
Thank you all so much. I really just want to just piggyback on what everything that has been said, right? But one thing I'll say, right, is especially to what Dr. Martinez said, there's I think an aspect of what the speech that Mara Matsuda gave, right? And she said, we've been through it all before, and when we're thinking about the lineage of CRT, think about what Dr. Garcia said, like we have to cite this lineage. You think about the lineage, I feel more powerful in my writing, right? And I think about the community, right? When I get, trolls, who do I reach out to? I reach out to my community. I reach out to Dr. Ray, right? How do I deal with this, right? And then even thinking about, before we pivot, even in thinking about like, what is the difference between writing CRT and doing CRT, living it? All of these panelists are living it, because it is actually a risk just to have your name, like your likeness attached to CRT, right? So even this webinar, to an extent, is a risk. So again, I want to thank you all just for holding space, sharing space at this moment. Maybe we'll come back to some of those lightning round questions, but I want to get to more specific questions with you all. And we will start off with Dr. Ray. This is a big question, but I know you've thought about this. Why do we need to understand CRT and its offerings right now, especially?
So I have a lot of things to say here. And
this is not lightning round, so you can. Okay,
I don't know how much time I have. Just cut me off if I tend to babble on, right? So I think, if you read the history, particularly like some of Crenshaw's work on sort of how CRT arose, one of the things that it was trying to do was to describe a backlash to the civil rights movement, right? And so there were these major successes of the civil rights movement that actually created the space for scholars who became critical race theorists by opening up schools and elite institutions. But, by the late 70s and early 80s, there was a backlash and it was winning. So critical race theorists said, the law that movement lawyers had used the law very successfully. Now that law is being used against us, or those victories were being undermined, and we need to develop a body of theory that explains how this happens, right? And I think if you look at some of the other things that Christopher Rufo has said about why he decided to target critical race theory, it was literally to stop the momentum of the George Floyd protest moment, right? And so he said, I was terrified by racial justice protests, right? Like, think about that sort of logic there. Like people saying, let us live, terrified him. So he said he read some of the works that were like going up bestseller lists at that moment. And he found some citations. He traced the citations too. He found citations to critical race theorists. And I might be doing a bad paraphrase, but he says something like he decided it was the perfect weapon to literally beat back the progress that people were asking for in that moment. I think critical race theory helps us understand a lot of the stuff that's happening in the current moment. So, like banning discussions of structural racism, as I've said a number of times, is a kind of structural racism. I think we could think about sort of the white normativity of the parents who are sort of shaping this debate and the way that students of color drop out of the debate on schools altogether about sort of what's being taught. There's a little focus of the impact of these laws on people of color, on LGBTQ students, and sort of the way that the panic has spread to now target trans students. And I think, it shows overall sort of like how fragile racial progress is. I think there was a number of, we had a whole new language of a racial reckoning following the George Floyd moment, and the belief among a lot of folks that the kind of structural interventions that schools and businesses said they were going to do was going to lead to some real change. And now I would argue, I have argued that like the backlash has actually been more powerful than that particular moment. So the other thing that I think is important to think about at this moment, and I've written about this too, is Bell's notion of interest convergence. And I actually think we're in a moment of interest divergence. And so for those in the audience who don't know about interest convergence, Bell argued that Brown v. Board didn't come about because of the goodness of white people's hearts, but because the success of the Soviet Union during the Cold War using racial injustice in the United States to get proxy states on their side during the Cold War, right? So there's, these decolonizing proxy states, and they're joining the Soviet Union because they're like, the US is structurally racist. So Bell posited, and then, historians backed up, that the Brown v. Board decision desegregating schools, that the State Department intervened and said, actually, this Russian propaganda is hurting us internationally. We need a PR victory, right? And this Supreme Court case would provide us with ammunition against sort of the Russian propaganda machine. So I think that was very important. It led to sort of a period of, you could argue about how much progress it was, but a period of desegregation and racial progress, right? And I think now, if you look at who the GOP and the folks pushing these laws are looking to, it's authoritarian states. The check that the Cold War had on the persecution of internal minorities in the United States is no more. And so, I wrote this piece about this, and I said DeSantis's law looks like it could have been drawn from Hungary. And then a few weeks after I wrote the piece, I saw one of DeSantis's aides literally say, when we wrote this law, we were looking to Hungary. Like, we use their laws as a model, right? And so you have the Trump administration and sort of the broader GOP touting Russia and Russian authoritarianism as a model. You have scholars writing about the sort of spread of the anti-CRT and book ban laws in the United States being modeled on memory laws in Russia, in Poland, and other places. So I think that points to sort of the diverging interests. And I think it's a really worrying omen to me, right? It's a really worrying portent about where things are going if there's not sort of that external check on the worst elements of US politics.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. Just, tell us more about your work, tell us more about like this moment. And again, I have to encourage you all to really look up the scope of Dr. Ray's work. He's written about interest divergence as well. So if that's something you're really interested in, check it out, right? Because he's written about this work. So next, our next question is to Dr. Briscoe. I'm thinking right now about the anti-CRT bans, anti-everything DEI in Florida, right? Do universities have a role in this anti-CRT moment? What, if anything, can or should universities do to support the work of CRT scholars?
Yeah, so obviously, Florida has some very troubling policies right now, right? And I want to personalize this for a minute. So I went to undergrad at Albany State University, a HBCU in Southwest Georgia, which is about an hour and 15 minutes from Tallahassee. So I've been both in community and in Florida, and have family in Florida. So it's not only troubling to see what is happening, but to understand that both the anti-CRT bans, the anti-DEI stance, the anti-LGBTQ / attack on trans, gay individuals, the now anti-Black tactics that are being used by trying to ban African-American AP courses. There's a lot of troubling political situations that are happening right now that are disheartening many individuals who are in Florida. It is intentional. It is political. It has been showing up in my data for many years now. I would say that it is in a stance and in a hope to drive out educators, students, minoritized individuals doing this work to completely ensure that the state is fully read, right? And so I want to start there before I get into particularly higher education and like what universities should be doing. And I'm gonna put some onus here on not just universities, we're going to talk about institutional actors, all right? So when I'm thinking about the Spencer study that Veronica and I are doing, one of the most telling stories from faculty members is particularly around the lack of response from administrators. And so last night I was actually both sitting with some work around interest convergence, as well as thinking about particularly the role of administrators and how they're leaning on faculty members in some stance of, you know, let's highlight the work that you're doing, right? But at the expense of literally violence, right? But then in the case of Florida, where you're actually being told not to do this work, right? You're being monitored and censored. You're having to completely slash curriculum and revamp courseworks for staff members. They can't use words like race and racism and slavery, everything that we know to be true and tied to history, right? And so when I think about what universities, particularly institutional actors, what I was writing about last night is not calling out administrators, but calling them in. This is your moment to show up and show out. And when I'm talking about administrators, I'm speaking to presidents, provosts, deans, department chairs. We cannot, not just Florida, I'm talking about Texas, Alabama, hell, I'm in Mississippi. We cannot allow this to happen because this is a continuous pattern. At this point, these laws are so intentional that only white, Christian, white men will have authority if we keep going this way, right? So if you are an institutional actor and you're on this call, here's some of the recommendations I was writing about last night, right? We love a good campus statement. We love a good town hall. We love a good ignoring whatever's happening, thinking it won't exist. That is not the way, right? What is the rhetoric that you're using on your campus to address this? Are you meeting with faculty who are doing this work? Are you protecting faculty that are doing this work? Don't just recruit faculty to come to your institutions and not support them and retain them, right? But are you assuring that they literally don't have violence showing up in their classroom spaces, right? And that could be moving different classes online. That could be taking their personal, helping them take their personal addresses from off the web. That could be, writing intentional narratives for tenure and promotion, knowing that this is going to go up the chain and may be influenced by regents who may have these same political ideologies, right? So how are you really doing this on different levels, right? Because we're already seeing right now in states like Florida and Texas, especially, where there's a mass exodus of educators, teachers, faculty, staff members who are leaving right now, right? Students who are leaving right now. But I'm gonna speak to people who are from Florida, right? Who have no aspirations of leaving right now. How are you fighting back, right? These class action suits, right? How are you draining the resources that the governor is using to enact this propaganda in a way that is intentionally making them change these laws, right? And so that is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be hard work. But if we get in coalitions and communities together, it can happen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Briscoe. I mean, and again, I really do hope university actors are listening, right? I mean, we're all stakeholders to an extent, but I think even in thinking about how it's important, Charles Lawrence once said it, you know, defining boundaries is important, knowing who is us and who is them, right? And if we're thinking, inaction is also telling us who is us and who is them. So thank you for that call to action, if you will. The next person we're going to hear from is Dr. Martinez. So let me get this up. So counter narratives, counter stories are central to critical race theory, right? We often hear about counter stories as a methodology, or counter narratives as a methodology, or as Martin Matsuda said, looking to the bottom as a source of knowledge and basis for theory. And you've talked already more about Richard Delgado and this aspect of storytelling. Can you tell us a bit more about your work with counter storytelling or counter narratives and how you understand this concept?
Yeah, this very much comes from my family's own tradition as Indigenous people, as oral storytellers. That was really just my natural mode and method of learning. So by the time I went into institutional learning spaces, I was already equipped with my family's own histories and knowledges that were told to me by my grandfather. And it was, you know, who we were, how we got here as, you know, Indigenous people into the borderlands of Arizona, which is where I'm from. And so early on, I was like, I think 6 years old, I already knew those stories. And I also knew and noticed they were absent from the textbooks at school. And I was starting to distinguish between what now I can name and identify as those master narratives that were happening at school versus what I was being told at home. And, you know, fast forward then to grad school and meeting up finally with CRT and the counter storytellers, and realizing there were Derek Bells and Richard Delgados and Mari Matsudas and Patricia Williams and Robert Williams, right? Those folks that were out there, and seeing how they were centering POC, centering our stories, making them central, and not just central, but crucial, right? To gathering our stories as data and making that what we would make our cases with through our research. And so through that is how I found the method and methodology for the research that I was going to then do, and that I've never looked back from ever since. And I knew as a humanities scholar that there was a gap to fill in my field to make this case for counterstory, to explore the question, well, what is it? How did it traverse from legal studies into education, into sociology? Because I was finding all the ways that the iterations of it in these different fields. And what I also knew was that, you know what, I need to start writing counter stories myself. I need to actually engage the practice of counter story beyond just studying it. So be a student of it, but also test the method. Because again, it's rhetoric and writing studies that I do within the humanities. And so I started testing the effectiveness of it through my own writing and looking at the different methods of Bell, Delgado, Patricia Williams in particular, and just looking at, okay, so when they have different things that they need to say, how do they each do that differently? And what does that result in? You know, Bell doing it through fantasy and allegory, Delgado doing it through these extended dialogues, Patricia Williams doing it through this almost like journaling kind of autobiographic mode. What does that result in depending on what they need to say to their audiences? And so I attempted to emulate those methods. I broke them down rhetorically, and that's very much what you see in my first book. That is, you know, again, a life's worth of work. That book was published in May 2020. Trump did his executive order by September 2020, and all hell broke loose. You know, when you talk about your name associated with a project within the context of that year, it was, you know, like I am Googleable, right? And so I've also, with as much negative as happened, I've had, you know, the ability to engage a lot of audiences because of that publication. And so I've watched what's happened, and I've had a lot of questions come my way, which is what sent me to that archive to start exploring, well, okay, so how did Derek Bell take what was very technical at first, because his "And We Are Not Saved" and "Faces at the Bottom of the Well" were law review articles first. They did not start as these very public facing, mass market press stories. They started in what were less accessible law reviews. They were still stories, but they were half a page of footnotes, right? They were for a different audience. So how did he revise them to then become what were meant for people who might have more of an 8th grade reading level, people who were the public, for everyone, right? He really wanted his message to get out and through. And so I'm working now with a historian who does a lot of Indigenous history. His name is Robert O. Smith. And for the past year, we've been in that archive, and what I thought was just that project about Bell and his writing process, which I think is a worthy question. I think it's interesting, right? Opened up so much more, because we found from the 1970s those early fiction pieces. And what we also found is that Bell was engaging a writing process with people like Alice Walker, because Alice Walker was his neighbor in Cambridge in the 70s. And she was giving him feedback on his early fiction pieces. He was sending his writing to her, and she was giving him feedback on the early stuff that he was writing that is not published. It's just in the archive. And so he was learning about and honing his craft of counter story in the 70s, and thinking about this method as he was also teaching it at Harvard. Okay, so it was pedagogical, it was methodological, and he's thinking about interest convergence at the time. All of that is coming together at the exact same time. So counter story was always central. And so that's the project that I'm working on now. And I think it's a uniquely humanities-centric project. It's a history-centric project. And I'm just really excited to write it with my research partner and present it very soon to everyone. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. And yeah, the world needs the book. I need the book. I'm so excited to hear more about that. And it's interesting because like I remember seeing in something Derek Bell wrote, he's like quoting Alice Walker. I was like, oh, you read Alice Walker? Cool. So that connection, yeah, thank you. I'm learning so much from all of you all. So excited about your work. So the next question we have is for Dr. Garcia. Much of CRT research is qualitative in nature. And you've been pushing not just education, but social science research more broadly to think about CRT and quantitative work in tandem. Can you tell us about what led you to pushing your work at the intersection of quantitative methods and CRT?
Yeah, so I'm just going to start with, I do not own these ideas. These ideas were birthed way before me. And I will have to give credit for Dr. Solosno, who's on the call right now, or who we call Danny, because it was actually Danny. And if you don't know Danny, he's like a wizard of CRT. Amazing, knows everything, trains a lot of us. But it was in his course, RAC, the Research Apprentice course, which anyone can still go to. I went to it like a couple weeks ago, where you generate ideas, right? And you get feedback on those ideas, you get love, you get care, you get pushback, right? You get everything. But one thing that Danny does in his classes too is he has, if you ever see his syllabus, it's like 25 pages and probably still growing, because he lists every single like study and article on CRT. Not like you're going to read it all, but eventually you will if you're really interested in this, right? And one area that he talks about is like what can be taken up, right? What can be taken up and further talked about and grappled with. And at the time I was going to the RAC, quantitative work wasn't really explored a lot. And Danny's trained as a sociologist of education, right? So he really brings that sociological lens. And at the time I had a dissertation that I was working on, where I was working with a secondary data set that was from a higher education institute. And it wasn't doing me any justice. I was like, this is not telling me anything about Puerto Rican or Mexican American students that I really want to know. But you know, if I go back and I string together all these data sets and I have an N of 500, then I can do an analysis and that will be good. But why? Like, why would I do that, right? And so I remember Danny being like, go read, go read. And he talked about, I know this one book and it's How to Lie with Statistics by David Huff. And it's basically taught, it's a general book, and you read it and you're like, oh, but I want more. Like, what about the race analysis? And so that's where we started thinking about going into different fields, and sociology was that field at the point. Like W. Du Bois had been doing this work since forever and just never got the validation from it. And there was also another edited volume called The Death of White Sociology, where there's a chapter in there by Joyce Lander, where it's a mixed method study, and they're grappling with these questions. And so for me, having been a young scholar doing a dissertation, I'm like, this is exactly what I need. And so in the special issue that we talk about quant crit and how it arrives in CRT, it was really at the Critical Race Studies Association where we got put together. It was Danny, Lindsay Vetto, Nancy Lopez, and myself were all put on a panel, and David Gilborn happened to be in the audience at that point. And he was interested in creating and curating and supporting a special issue on quantitative methods and race work. And so that's how it was birthed. I would say that I was fortunate to have these more senior scholars invest in me as a junior scholar to really put forward this work and grapple with it. How are we thinking about it? And so we met a couple of times at UCLA to think through who's doing this work, right? And we never ever assumed that this special issue would be the first and last. We always knew it was just the impetus, the start, right? And that we would have so much more to do. And so I think from there, I started asking questions. But I remember being in class one time and Danny was like, you need to explain descriptive statistics right now. Tell us the frequencies and all of this for my dissertation. I was like, are you being for real right now? But the thing about him is that it's unique to accessibility, right? If you know how to talk about these numbers, you know that folks are engaged with it. So in the early 2000s, they started creating the educational pipeline, right? So it's coming from Danny, it's coming from Octavio Villalpando and Tara J. Yasso, and they're thinking through how numbers and where are the leaks in the pipeline. And then the next generation picks it up, and then the next generation picks it up. So again, how do we think about quant crit? I don't own these ideas. We wrote this so that it's taken up, right? It's taken up in responsible and ethical ways. And so I get a lot of requests around, well, how do you do it? Like, I need to know how to run a multiple regression through a quant crit lens. And my response to that is so often, I'm not interested in the how, I'm interested in the why. Why are you doing this work? Do you understand the theory? Are you doing quant work to be relevant? Or are you doing this to change the material, physical, and emotional conditions of the communities that you're a part of and care about? Because that is the heart of the work for me personally. So I get asked a lot to do these, well, higher inferential statistical stuff. And I'm not interested in that. Like, I'm not trained as a statistician. I know stats, yes, but I'm not an evaluation measurement and evaluation person. But you expect me to be that and everything else, right? Are we asking the same of you on the other end, right? Majority white males? No, but you want to do this work. So are the interests converging, or what's going on, right? And so I think for this time being, we're in a place of rethinking and thinking through what other theoretical frameworks can we join with quant crit to really think through what this looks like. And like I had previously said, that I work at the intersections of Chicana Latina feminist work, and Dolores Salgado Bernal was also on my committee. And I remember I was like, I have all these questions. And she said, you don't have to have all the answers for them right now. And I was like, oh, okay, I can keep writing. But now to take up that work is really important. And I think we're at this juxtaposition where I'm thinking through, what does it mean to reclaim and rethink and honor all the mathematical wisdom that comes from our communities, right? And so I give this example often, that I had mathematical genius and experts in my household, starting from my grandmother, who could bake by just touch and scent and eyesight. How do we measure that? We don't, right? And so how can we think through responsibly these projects that then can enter everyday words and translate that into numbers that teach us stats? And then maybe there's new ways to think about how do we create that. So I just got approval to kind of do a study around Latinas and how they embody their mathematical wisdom. So shout out, I'll be coming for folks to engage in that. But that's one way I think through, and I'm looking forward to doing the work. And I would say this is a collective coming up, right? I didn't do this alone. this is definitely informed by folks that went before me, and as thought partners, specifically Beto Velez and Lindsay Perez-Huber, who helped me push this as a critical race feminista is really important. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garcia. And I love how you're emphasizing the collective, right? It's more than just, we're not here trying to colonize this topic, right? This is me, I coined, you know, like that's, even if you did, right? It's still within the community that these ideas are birthed and created and honed, right? For the good of the community. And I also have to say as well, I took critical race theory with Dan Solorzano as well. So thank you for opening up the class for me. As I was just a student from USC traveling across town to get this, to get that experience. So, and as a note, I do want to say, like, Dr. Rall and I were intentional in trying to reach out and learn from more of the rising scholars, more junior, not from the more typical, like folks that we know have been in the field for a while. So obviously our panelists are you know, prolific in various ways, but we were intentional about choosing you all, and I'm loving the conversation already. But we want to switch gears a bit and try to get some questions from the audience. We have so many questions. We will not be able to answer all the questions. I apologize in advance. But Dr. Rall, do you want to share one of the questions that has been put in the Q&A?
Sure. And as Dr. Tichavakunda just, you know, kind of alluded to, as they say in the church, the hour is far spent, right? So we don't have a lot of time. So we're going to try to get to as many as we can. And I'm going to try to collapse. And I know this won't be verbatim, folks, so forgive me for your questions, but I'm going to collapse a couple of these questions into one. So one of the first questions is really just sort of, how do we counter folks that we're hearing on Fox News, that we hear, you know, come across in the street, policies that are happening in the schools? If we're living in Florida, if we're living in Texas, all the haters, all these folks who are sort of pushing against us, what are the recommendations you all have for what you can say? Folks are asking it to be explicit. What are some talking points? They want some bullet points that they could come back at folks with to kind of just talk about the importance of CRT. So anyone who feels led, and then we'll sort of try to move through.
I can talk about this because I've been doing a little bit of it. So I think it's important. I think there's a number of ways, right? So I'll try to be as brief as I can, but I'll give two. So one is, I've pointed out that you know, Christopher Rufo and the folks pushing this are disinformation merchants, right? Like their job is disinformation. And so I don't know how aware folks are, but Christopher Rufo was for, before he became sort of the right's leading racist propagandist, he worked for the Discovery Institute, which, for those of us in education, know pushed the teach the controversy around evolution, and they pushed what did they call it? You know, they tried to undermine the teaching of Darwinian theory, right, in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so Rufo has like adopted those tactics and used those tactics for attacking CRT. And, you know, someone who undermines the scientific consensus on something like evolution probably shouldn't be setting educational policy. And I would say there's not really much debate among social scientists that structural racism is real and leads to negative health outcomes, negative educational outcomes, negative outcomes in all manner of sort of places, right? And even like medical scientists and doctors actually now recognize this, right? Like this is not a fringe theory. They're actually the ones promoting like crack science and fringe theory. The other thing I would say is like, go to the sources, right? Rufo like has admitted that, I forget who talked about him like trying to tarnish the brand. Like he's admitted he's lying, right? And you can say like, here are, you know, Delgado and Stefanchik's intro book. Is what he's saying lining up with what they're saying about the theory, right? Or here is the data on health outcomes. Here's the data on educational outcomes. Does this line up with the idea that structural racism is not a thing? And I think good faith people will be convinced. And then the final thing I'll say is like, it does not make sense, choose your battles. It does not make sense to me to argue with bad faith people, right? It's just, it's wasting everyone's time.
Anyone else want to add? Y'all are waiting for that juicier question, waiting for the one just for you, right? Okay, we'll jump to another question. And so there are a few questions really just talking about what's the relationship between CRT and STEM and engineering. And Nicole, I don't know if you want to grab this one, but folks sort of separating it. And is there a connection that can be made in these other sectors, right? There are a few questions touching on that.
Yeah, I'll just go broad. Yes, our people have been doing this work forever. There's a reason why there's erasure, right? So colonization happened for a reason. I think that I just got an email from a chemist today that's like, hey, do you want to be on an advisory board? I'm trying to do CRT work in STEM, know nothing about students of color and equity. And I'm a statistician too. I'm like, yeah, sure. So I think it's crossing in these spaces where they may make you feel uncomfortable as a scholar that may be trained as just a qualitative person or not, but it's also having conversations with foundations. I don't know how many times I've gotten NSF foundations to review, which I try to review as responsibly as possible. And I'm just gonna put shade out there, honestly, like they're funding white men to do this work. And there's other scholars that have been doing this work, but we get reviewed that say like, we don't know how to do the work, yet we're the one that generated the ideas and built upon communities that have been doing it. So for funders, I say, look at who the scholars are, right? Like know that we have the best interest in our communities and that our communities are telling us what they need, because CRT scholars around the activism part, we're on the ground and we're there. And so pushback to this attack on CRT, you know, we just have to go to the ethnic studies movement that happened in Arizona and the banning. You saw activism happening every single day. Right. And so it was students that went out and protested. And we know students always have movement and power, and they've been doing it for generations. Now, how do we support them in this struggle, right? Especially as folks that are part of institutions. You have to be willing to give up a certain protection in order to then be a part of something. And, you know, these institutions are just part of the everyday struggle. I'm not going to say they're for us, right? But we live in them and we thrive in them. But long story short, I think there is so much room for collaboration, and any person that has the opportunity to be invited into a STEM conversation is super important so that we can get those cross collaborations. Because again, one of the big tenets in CRT-NET is the interdisciplinary nature of it. So how are we extending ourselves outside of things we're comfortable with to be uncomfortable? And I will say that foundations are looking at this now and really thinking how to do it. And just to shout out to a few scholars out there that have left the academy and are doing great freaking work, like Jalil Bishop has started his own nonprofit organization in Philadelphia, killing the game, but we don't talk about it. So I just had to give that shout out, who's doing all of this work, millions of dollars invested in his nonprofit. So there are examples out there.
And I'll throw in with that too, again, because I always have to come at the STEM question as a humanities person and say, like, there is, from the methodological standpoint of CRT, if it's one of them is storytelling, and within STEM and the sciences, when you're applying for funding, when you're explaining things to audiences and communities about your results and your findings, like, give me an example of any of those instances that does not involve storytelling in some capacity. You have to know these modes and these methods and be responsible with all of that. And then on top of that, there are things that happen to you know, like marginalized and minoritized people within STEM and, you know, the sciences that merit storytelling, right? You know, like experiences that need to be told and realized in certain ways. So, you know, that's something that can very much use CRT's methodology of counter story.
All right, maybe we can squeeze in another one, but there is a question asking how y'all feel about some of the spinoffs, as it was phrased, of Black crit, Indigenous crit, queer crit, and all these different critical frameworks. Any thoughts on that?
Love it. Hello. One of the pieces that I think Delgado Bernal, they wrote one, but Solorzano and Yoso wrote CRT and sociology, and in it they have this awesome diagram where it's like, where do we draw from? We draw from feminist studies, there's Marxism, there's all these different offshoots. Like, that's the point, right? Is to have these offshoots. Again, we don't own how we think about it. Are there responsible ways to do it? Absolutely. Right. You're going to know your own experience and how it looks. But there are those nuances for a reason.
Yeah, and I'll add, so even the CRT classes that I've taught, I'm a huge advocate for incorporating offshoots into the discussion and teaching those pieces. I particularly often am drawn to Black crit. But I think, when we think of crits, my thing is, yes, we need them. We should be using them, especially when we're talking about different intersections of identities that, have maybe been left out of the larger conversations. But I also think there's a piece of, when you're using that, make sure you're still honoring CRT work too, right? And how these two are interconnected. And I think that's when you do great work, right? Recognizing both of those pieces and the uniqueness of those.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And I think we're at time. We're at time. I'm going to talk a little bit more. I'm gonna end with one little quote real quick. Thank you all so much. But again, same thing, Charles Lawrence. And he concludes his speech in 1997 saying this: Derek Bell says that racism is permanent. One thing is for certain, none of us will live long enough to know whether he is right. So we're in this fight for the long haul. And Derek is certainly right when he says we struggle because that is what gives life meaning. That is what gives us joy. I, for one, am glad I'm in this struggle with all of you. Similarly, I'm glad I'm in this struggle with all of you, the panelists, the folks who are watching. Thank you again to the Pullias Center for sponsoring. And again, this will be recorded, and you should hear from us at some point about the drawing for the books. Dr. Rall, you want to hop in? I'm sorry.
No, you're right. You're saying it right. We'll send a follow-up where you'll have the recording, link to the recording. You'll also have, we have curated from the panelists and some other sources, sort of a good starting list, right, on suggested readings, and then those you might want to be a little cautious of, that sort of thing, to kind of help folks to guide their reading and their thinking. And that will also live on the Pullias website for a little bit of time as they have space. But we will follow up with the winners so that you will know there are actual 5 winners, and we didn't keep the books for ourselves because we're also like, let me get those books, right? But we will send those things out. And I just echo the thanks to the Pullias Center and to all of our panelists, and to you for taking time out on a Thursday to join us, and to be continued. The conversations will continue. So thank you all.